Hi everyone. Just give it a couple of minutes for people to come into the meeting. It takes a while for people to get in, but just bear with us for a moment and we'll get going as soon as we can. And a really warm welcome to you to Social Work Week 2024 and to this event, which is What's Your Theory for Change? How practice models are supporting better social work with children and families in 2024. Really looking forward to it. So my name is Vicky Hart. I'm Regional Engagement Lead for London at Social Work England. I'm just going to run through some housekeeping slides before I hand over to our presenters. So legal disclaimer. Any views, information or opinions expressed by third parties during Social Work Week are the speaker's own and do not necessarily reflect the views of Social Work England or its employees. Social Work England have not endorsed third-party content. Social Work England accepts no liability for the content of third-party or sector-led sessions during Social Work Week. And the privacy notice. Your privacy is important to us. By providing personal information such as your name and email address, you agree to us contacting you for the purposes of event management and evaluation. Your personal information will be used solely by us for the purpose it's collected. Personal data will be retained for up to 3 years in accordance with our data retention schedule. I'm going to now hand over to our presenters, Rob and Paul, and to introduce themselves in the session.
Thanks, Victoria. It's great to be here. I was involved last year and it was a really important and helpful thing to be part of. So I'm really looking forward to today. I'm Rob Tyrrell. I am Principal Social Worker for Children and Families in Gloucestershire. And for the past almost 2 years, I've also had the privilege of being one of the 3 co-chairs of the National Principal Social Worker Network, which has led to our involvement today, really. So I'm really pleased to be here with my colleague, Paul McGee. Paul, are you going to introduce yourself as well?
Very good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, Paul McGee. I'm the Principal Child Family Social Worker in Essex, and alongside Rob and our colleague Clare Poyner, I've been co-chairs of the National Network now for around a year and a half. So absolutely delighted to be invited to be with you this afternoon to talk about social work practice.
We're also really lucky, and I'm really pleased to have a variety of other people joining us today throughout the rest of the afternoon. Nikki, who didn't know much about what I was asking her until yesterday, has stepped in. So Nikki's with us already, which is great. She and other colleagues will be providing, I think, a real practice perspective to what we're talking about. This is moving beyond, I guess, the theoretical conversations around what we'd like to do to how we actually might be or are applying whatever a model for practice is into our social work and social care practice. So it's really great to have you here. Okay. So basically today we have around an hour. I think the last half hour is an opportunity for you as practitioners, as participants, as people who've made the effort to be here today, to share your ideas, to share your thoughts. So as the day progresses, could you please write down, especially during the spaces we create for pauses or pausing time for reflection, please write down any questions, thoughts or ideas you have, and we'll certainly make some space at the end of the day to open that up and have a conversation with you all around the kind of themes that we've talked about today.
There's relatively a lot of content here, but we are inviting you as well to think about this as part of reflection and discussion today, and would like to think that you may have some conversations with colleagues outside of here, maybe back in your teams or service areas as well, to keep the conversation going after today.
Yeah. So am I able to move the slides using this arrow, Victoria? Is that you?
That's me. So if you just ask me to move the slides,
yes. If you can move to in today's session, I think that'd be great.
It should be there now.
Okay, I can certainly see it. Just a bit of feedback, a bit of an overview really around today then. So Paul and I and our colleagues will be talking and very much having a conversation, sharing some stories, experiences and ideas around what is this thing called a model for practice. It's a phrase. A practice model is definitely a phrase that seems to be more in precedence at the moment. There seems to be a slight urgency around authorities and organisations looking for something to connect to what we're doing as social workers and social care staff. It also reflects, I think, the diversity of involvement that we have within children's social work and social care settings. So we're going to be looking at why choose this particular model? You know, what is the impact of this? What's the point of having a particular model to hang our social work practice to? How does that connect to other models? And how does it actually, if it does at all, connect to practice improvements and better outcomes for children, families and communities, which may be why we're involved in social work in the first place. We're going to try, and this will be trying, I think, to locate this discussion in the context of the huge changes that we're living and working amongst at the moment within children's social care and social work. So I'm talking about the national reforms linked to stable homes built on love and the expectations that will be affecting all of us and hopefully driven by us within the national practice framework. So Victoria, if you could move on, that'd be really good.
So when you hear the words practice model, what comes to mind? So first, opportunity to pause and reflect. As Rob's already outlined, it can mean lots of different things in different ways, but you may want to apply this and think about your own experience and own working context. Visuals deliberately kind of posing some kind of questions or potentially dilemmas around that balance between theory and practice and how do they interrelate. And the scale and the kind of balancing could also invite you to think about different tipping points and about where emphasis is actually placed in practicing our work with children, young people and families.
And Nikki and I were talking just not so long ago, a few minutes ago, really, just about, I guess, our experiences as students and the focus on theory as a student, as you'd expect, and you'd certainly hope. But often, certainly in my experience, on actually joining a local authority, the absence of that kind of dialogue and discussion around theoretical models as they were applied to practice. And that's maybe a question you can ask yourselves, and we can go to it towards the end of the session around what did that feel like in your own career to actually join an organisation? Was there a visible practice model? When you heard about it, or when you were involved in it, what did that feel like? What did it look like? How were you actually applying things to practice? And what level of information, resources, guidance or support existed around that?
If we move the slides on. So we're grappling before today, just thinking about practice models. How do we begin to go about articulating or defining what a practice model actually is? So just going to run through one working definition from Simmons University. It's not the only definition, but it's one we wanted to share today. In terms of social work practice models, describe how social workers can implement theories. Practice models provide social workers with a blueprint of how to help others based on the underlying social work theory. While a theory explains why something happens, a practice model shows how to use a theory to create change. So you may want to think about to what extent this current working definition we're sharing today resonates with your experience around social work and social work practice with families. And again, we'll hope you're actively using the Q&A function to post thoughts and reflections. Over to you, Rob.
Linked to that, and if you can all see the slide, I created a question for myself when we were talking about how we might create this session today, and it's very much about the stories around practice that affect us all as social workers. And what became apparent to me was, haven't we been here before? Isn't this a kind of pretty frequent discussion that we have as social workers at whatever level we might be? I was looking at a book by Isabel Tyrrell and Steve Goodman that lots of you will be aware of, called Social Work Reclaimed, that worryingly or interestingly was written 12 years ago. Talking about the introduction of a systemic practice model to Hackney and all the impetus and excitement that led to as kind of innovative approach to social work. And at the front of that was a preface or a foreword by Ivy Monroe, who'll be familiar to many of us, linked to her National Review of Child Protection, which was into only in 2011, but seems like a lifetime ago. And certainly in terms of the children and families we work with, you know, there's significant movement culturally, societally, and in lots of other ways over the past 14 or so years. But what Eileen had already identified at that point was that there was a kind of uneasy and unbalanced system where compliance with performance indicators and procedures had been eroded or was eroding the space for creative work. And I just wondered all those years later where we are now, given we spend a lot of our time being preoccupied with the very same things. Bureaucratic demands and rigid timescales are hindering social workers from engaging constructively and flexibly with families. And I guess if you go into any social work office on a Wednesday afternoon, that might be one of the features of the conversations around that very uneasy balance between paperwork, between ICS systems, between resources, between what we say we like to do, which is that direct contact and involvement with families. Eileen also highlighted all those years ago that the possibilities that, for example, the Hackney model might have enabled, you know, revisions to social work training, reductions in centralised prescription, and changes in inspection criteria should help social work to make the journey from a compliant to a learning organisation. And in some ways, it feels quite poignant, doesn't it, that here we are all those years later, still grappling with the same issues. Although we do have, I guess, through Stable Homes Built on Love and the national framework, depending on how you read it and how you perceive it, an opportunity to take control again, or at least make representations and begin that process collectively to start thinking around how would we make change? What would it look like? What does it look like in practice? Okay, if you can move on, Victoria, that would be good.
And that led us to think about some of these notions and ideas around defensive decision making, and to what extent in our work on occasions or on an ongoing basis we feel positioned or actually in a kind of space of defensive decision making. So what does that mean? So we're really thinking about around practice where there is a focus on avoiding blame, either of one's own self or potentially from an agency perspective. The valuing or overvaluing around due diligence, or this kind of defense of saying, you know, it's fine because I followed procedures, or being very procedural. And just really thinking about the location of social work really within, to what extent the current societal situation or working world influences defensiveness or defensive practice. So, for example, you're more likely to be blamed if you leave a child at home and they suffer harm than if you remove a child who potentially fares less well in the care system. Some real dilemmas there, and I think within this context, we often I think in social work feel the kind of pressure to eliminate risk rather than thinking about management of risk or proportional risk management and some of those ideas. And to what extent this potentially reduces the instances of balanced assessments of what might happen, thinking about good, bad to a child or adult. So some real dilemmas there. So if we move on to the next slide.
Just going back to what you were saying, Paul, because I think there's 200 odd people here, and I don't think what you shared will be unfamiliar to everybody, but it's not something we quite rightly perhaps feel comfortable about talking about that whole balance and tension and conflict between procedure and process and autonomy and agency is a really difficult one, but it's also one that's at the heart of practice, isn't it? Yeah, maybe we're moving towards in this conversation how a particular practice model or models might support a different way of looking at those kind of procedural aspects of our role.
I'm thinking of it as well from defensive decision making to what does positive risk taking actually look like, and what would those examples begin to feel like or be articulated in practice?
Absolutely. I'm aware that I'm surrounded by my two colleagues. So Sarah's joined us, and Sarah, you're an advanced educator in our social work academy in Gloucestershire. Yeah. And I've introduced Nikki as well. And what I did say earlier was that if you felt like interjecting or challenging us at any point, feel free.
Okay, well, sure.
Good. No compulsion. So Victoria, if we could move through again. Okay. So we were really lucky in the past couple of weeks, Paul and I, to have a conversation with Eileen Monroe, who's been over the past couple of years a kind of a really helpful, critical friend to the three of us as co-chairs. We felt this was especially important and also a privilege, I guess, given her involvement and emphasis on the need for and the importance of a principal social worker within local authorities, certainly in children's services, and her interest in how that has played out over the subsequent 14 years since she wrote the review. So we met Eileen and had a kind of open conversation around wondering what her views were on practice models and frameworks, given her promotion of these on particular areas of these, in previous years, and the level of influence she'd had with government decisions linked to children's social care and social work since her review, if not before. What we didn't get, which is great and not surprising, was a prescription or a list or a message of what we should say. What she did do, though, was very much share some principles and ideas around whatever a practice framework or model could or should be. These would be the best features. What she understood from authorities, organisations, teams and people that were informed by a particular practice model was that we recognised and privileged particular attention to key areas. And again, these will be familiar to people. This is nothing new, but actually naming it is important. So there's something about a practice model that very much pays attention to working conditions, the importance of time, the team and the supervision relation and all this. What I can see also that we've missed the slide here. I don't know if we could go back, Victoria. That's better. Okay. So what Eileen was really keen to get across, I think, and was really helpful to us, is that a practice model helps practitioners at whatever level and the organisation at whatever level of strategy or organisational involvement to identify and develop, literally, this is how we do it around here. Not a prescription or a list or a procedure or a directive, but a feeling around it's recognisable. This is our approach to practice. This is our approach to working with children and their families and the wider community and partners. And also importantly, the people in this room. And that's an interesting one, isn't it? If you think of the organisations that we join and the way that we work with each other and the way we talk about each other, or the way we talk about families, or the multi-agency partners we work with, sometimes that's not clear what the expectations are, or what my own expectations are of how I should behave, or what I should be thinking, or what I could be thinking. What a practice model also helps us to do is to identify that we can see a value base. It exudes from the organisation outwards and through that organisation. It's not necessarily little pockets of that organisation. Wherever you might go, there's going to be more and more examples of a shared value base, a shared language, a shared practice, and a shared understanding of what we might be doing next. A massively key point, which was so helpful actually, was we're working with families to find solutions, not to be punitive, not to just create ticking the right box, not to get someone through that court process, not to move that child away from their family, looking for solutions. They may not be the immediate solution. They may be a solution that we never thought of before. They may be a solution that's not particularly palatable to you or I, but actually they are different solutions. Also creates challenge and opportunity to promote particular themes, particular ethoses, particular, I guess, value bases across our conversations. So what if we worked in an organisation? What if we had a personal practice that was about not doing things to families? So using those restorative relational principles and actually meaning it and doing it, because not doing things to would imply we might want to do things with, and I think that's far harder. Linked to that also then is that kind of opportunity to say, I'm tired of pathologizing families. I'm tired of the us and them. I'm tired of them being bad, yeah, and somehow us being just the good people. there has to be that dialogue around why things got to where they are at the moment and the solution focus that we had before. And also importantly, this is not just about a single agency approach. It lives and succeeds on how we share this with other agencies, which is a massive challenge if you think of God knows how many years of the welfare state and the barriers, if not the opportunities in that. How do we have a common language with our health colleagues, with police colleagues, with education, with voluntary agencies, with everybody in communities?
And in that context, it's really important to think about our own relationship with risk and articulation and of working with risk. And Eileen has talked about notions of not moving away from risk elimination to being risk sensible, and how we have a sensible conversation about risk. We've had a lot of conversations within the network about the working conditions and working environments to allow and support social work to flourish in quite challenging and dynamic situations. The importance of time and space, the ergonomic environment, crucial role of the team as a supportive environment in which to test things out, ideas, but also the actual integral part of supervision that underpins all of this. And moving away from not seeing our work in isolation as individual practitioners and thinking about how we share and coalesce around the work. And I think it's just identifying as well that change doesn't come in isolation, and how we need to continue to strive and find effective ways to think about our support and nurturance around our staff. And because we've had a number of conversations, our staff remain such an integral resource in our ongoing work to support children, young people and their families. And it's how we take that view as well and move away from, if you like, an over focus on compliance and prescriptions, patterns, and how we retain that integral approach to relational social work. And it's just interesting thinking about, and we will touch on this a bit later on. I mean, clearly the work is complex, and there are barriers and challenges, but there is also a far stronger research evidence base to reinforce some of these approaches around practice frameworks. See, Rob's going to come in at this point.
So I always have that look about me, Paul, don't I, when I'm about to say something? I'm
Yeah.
really aware of that. I just need to sit still. I just wanted to really emphasise the conversation we had with Eileen about working conditions as well, because often that feels like it's out of our control as practitioners, and to some extent it might be. There are wider national implications and kind of local resource implications and application actually relating to working conditions. But there's something about the use of time, the importance of time with families, the preciousness of that time and the purpose of that time that we need to maintain kind of emphasis on as practitioners at all level, don't we? No matter what practice model we might be utilising. The increasingly, and the evidence would show us this, the importance of the team, the nurture from the team, the challenge from the team is important. The presence of the team manager and whoever else has that kind of leadership role can be pretty significant in the direction and the support and nurture of that team. And throughout that, the importance of supervision. This isn't an add-on. This isn't a performance indicator or measure. This is something about a relationship between two or more people, isn't it? That is integral to that kind of conversation about risk, about feelings.
Yeah, no, it's thinking about your working life in terms of that balance between being in face-to-face arenas with your line managers and team, as opposed to working more remotely, and thinking about the balance of that in the context of busy working lives.
Yeah.
So we move on to the next slide. It's just really interesting just to reflect on the social work role in supporting children, young people and families, thinking about what we can, what we can't control, where our own values and beliefs fit in. So I just wanted to highlight this from Justice Headley, which I often think about really just in terms of the work that I'm involved in. I'll kind of go through it. Society must be willing to tolerate very diverse standards of parenting, including the eccentric, the barely adequate, and the inconsistent. It is not the provenance of the state to spare children all the consequences of defective parenting. The state does not and cannot take away the children of all the people who commit crimes, who abuse alcohol or drugs, who suffer physical or mental illness or disabilities. So I think we just wanted to give everyone a moment to kind of pause and just think about what you yourself bring into the work, your own belief systems, and how we use judgment in the context of our decision making, underpinned by the different practice frameworks that we utilize. And I'm sure we've all been in a situation where we're encountering situations where we may think we're finding things that are difficult to comprehend or manage, or we don't personally agree with. But again, it's going back to what is it that is our role within this, and and when is it that we need to think about our intervention support, and when is it that we need to let go and respect family life. I think there's some real challenging dilemmas there for us to grapple with as practitioners, frontline practitioners and managers.
There's opportunity there as well, just in that statement, isn't there? I think it makes you wonder about the distance that we've created and that might have been encouraged elsewhere. The distance between us and the families that we work with. The focus on the child being at the heart of everything we do is absolutely valid, but it also at times misses the context of children coming from very diverse families and communities where they belong. And perhaps if the efforts were more connected to the wider community and family, as well as and because of that child, that would be another interesting thing. And sometimes practice models can also support a kind of different view and a different approach to the same story, the same often quite tired story about families.
So if we move on, please.
There's further context, which I to the conversation today and the link to practice models, which is the very interesting digitalized world that we live in. You can't help but see every time you turn on the radio or look at your phone about something around digital media and all the implications of that. In social work, it touches on it in numerous ways, but perhaps not in a way that we're particularly comfortable with. And that skepticism is important, but we may be missing something here. And Paul, this is a quote from your Director of Children's Services, which I think was really helpful because it's completely contemporary and of now in terms of the opportunity we have. So we're in a contemporary world where practice models and digital space need to make good friends and work to mutually reinforce that practice model, help hold the change work with families.
Yeah, and
isn't that interesting though, in terms of the usual knee-jerk reaction, including of myself, would be that digital solutions and AI solutions are completely anathema, if that's the right word, to restorative relational systemic practice. But actually there's something about looking at things in a different way and looking at or seizing different opportunities and connections with people.
Yeah, and whether we like it or not, we're very much in an increasingly technological, digitalized world, which is something that as a social care workforce, we need to, if you like, embrace and work with and influence, rather than, if you like, take a back seat. So if we move on, we're going to give you, I know on Teams, 10 seconds can feel like an awful lot of time. So just a moment to pause, gather your thoughts before we move on.
It's also an opportunity, if you're using the Q&A function or just to write down any ideas or thoughts or feelings you've had around the already increasingly vast things that we've started to talk about today.
This is a live prompt, so if we imagine we've got a gearbox, we're going to slightly shift gear now and just move a little bit more pace through the next section. So if we move on to the next slide. We felt it was absolutely opportune and appropriate to talk about the National Practice Framework for a few moments. We anticipate there'll be different levels of understanding and familiarity. Core purpose of National Practice Framework is thinking about the role of children's social care and its pivotal role to support children, young people and families, to protect them by intervening decisively when they're at risk of harm, and to provide care for those who need it, so they grow up and thrive with safety, stability and love as an opening. As is outlined here, a number of principles that underpin the practice framework, which I'm sure people can resonate with in terms around a child young person's welfare, wishes and feelings being paramount and heard and responding to, the key notions of partnership, about children and young people being raised within their family networks and communities wherever possible, effective multi-agency work, and take into account the social and economic circumstances in which children, young people and families reside. This has identified a number of key outcomes for the workforce, which are documented here, as well as enablers around supporting social work practice. So this is very much at a glance. If we move on to the next slide, please.
So in addition to the framework, there's also a dashboard, which I guess on initial hearing or reading for us as practitioners could be seen as, here's another way of measuring things, of counting things, of creating a kind of league table, both locally and nationally, of who's doing well and who isn't, and who knows, maybe it is. I think within that also there is an opportunity, and that'll be reinforced by the conversations that Paul, Clare and I have had nationally. You know, there is an opportunity here through our involvement as practitioners in informing some of the statutory guidance around the indicators, around the enablers and the outcomes that are looked for within the framework, to actually start to shift not just our own practice, but also the perceptions of other people who've got an investment in children's social work and social care. A key quote here would be that the dashboard is also intended to improve timeless accessibility and comparability of social care data, but also as a learning tool for central and local government, very much a learning tool, not just a stick to beat people with, but it's not a tool to measure or assess performance. What if we were to actually use this as a tool for ourselves, for our individual practice, as a framework or an invitation and an opportunity to build our own practice? Because the key thing here over the next year is that different local authorities have, 11 months or less to actually start to implement this.
So you might want, so you might want to think about both individually and collectively in terms of what's happening in your organisations in relation to this kind of currently, or what's planned. And it's certainly an active conversation we're having across the Children's Principal Social Worker Network. Yeah. So move on to the next slide. Another pause point. So just thinking about the care review being very focused on practical support.
Was Paul removed from the building by the look of it in mid speech?
It might be Teams being a bit playing up. I'm sure he'll be back before we know it.
That's fantastic. What Paul was sharing was another kind of live observation from Helen Lincoln, the DCS in Essex, which was very much around the principles of what the care review was intending to do, being focused on practical support that helps families. The practice model is a key thing around an approach to how you actually land that change with families. So practical support is one thing. The theory of change behind that is crucial, really. So what are the key facets of the things that Eileen was talking about in the earlier slides? The value base, the way of looking at that family and our involvement with that family, and the stories and history of that involvement and how we're perceived. How might that actually impact on how we're going to implement those particular practicalities that come out of the care review and the framework? Paul, you've miraculously appeared again.
Apologies for that. That was a real surreal moment. I was ejected out of the meeting just while I was in mid-flow, so apologies for that. I'm now back, so just working with the turbulence of Teams.
I've given my own interpretation of Helen's other quote, which made completely odds with what she was saying. But
again, it's something for you to go away and ponder. So if we move on to the next slide.
So again, this is all a bit of a story around, we've been here before, but a lot of the themes are as relevant today as they were. For example, when Yvette Stanley, the director of Ofsted, was sharing this. So it may be interesting or unexpected, but Ofsted doesn't endorse any particular model or approach. What they did recognise, and what inspectors have recognised over numerous years, is good and outstanding authorities have models that impact positively on children's progress and experiences. Kind of goes without saying, doesn't it? What Yvette did come up with as an overview of those authorities that had effective practice models were those models had a whole system approach. There wasn't one part of the organisation that had a really fantastic practice model. It would have been the whole system and different parts of the system, different people with involvement in that system, and those wider systems all knew, and to the extent that they needed to, understood the implications and the application of that practice model. I think it goes back to what Eileen was saying again. Those authorities also have a clear ethos. That ethos could be described and shared by any practitioner at whatever level of the organisation in the context that makes sense for them. It's also about the commitment of authorities to develop a confident and committed workforce, and what authority wouldn't say they did that or would want to do that, but it's creating those conditions and the language for that to happen, as well as identifying and, I guess, protecting the resources that are necessary for that. And within that also, I guess there's the need for clear expectations. It's one thing talking about an eclectic practice model that we pick and choose from, but there needs to be expectations within that. There needs to be direction and bottom line and procedure and policy and accountabilities within that. So it's the foundations that are required for people to gain their own autonomy and agency in understanding and applying that practice model. And also, and this will be familiar to all of us, there needs to be a focus of and monitoring of the impact. So it's more than just the words and the rhetoric. It's actually around how do our actions create change and positive, sustainable change for families. If we could move on, Victoria, thank you. So again, Ofsted are not necessarily, I'm sure they're interested, but actually the model is more about, does it contain the right ingredients to support better practice? Those authorities that are succeeding or creating better outcomes or creating sustainability or building communities and have a positive influence and effect on communities have a family-focused approach, a whole family-focused approach. Valuing stable relationships, that's not just the stability of relationships within families, it's the relationships between colleagues, it's the relationships between partner agencies, it's the relationships in every room that we're in. And that's no mean feat, because there's a lot of stories and feelings and patterns of behaviour that are comfortable in their discomfort as well. Having a shared model across agencies is a great ambition, and it's quite a difficult one, but also, again, those places where things are working and maintained, that's what people endeavour to do. And it's about focusing on strengths and balancing that with risks. Again, it's easy to say that doing it is quite a nervous place to be, which links back to, again, what we were saying earlier, around the importance of the team, around the importance of supervision, and that belonging to somewhere where you can recognise the value base and where you belong. And within that, and I think this is likely to appeal to all of us, it's about direct work and the opportunity for that, but also the purpose of that, the meaning of that, the sustainability of it. Throughout that is the need for intertwining those systemic approaches that might inform and enhance all those diverse activities.
If we move on to the next slide. So thinking about 7 features of practice and 7 outcomes, and this is drawn upon an evaluation of round 1 of the Children's Social Care Innovation Programme going back to October 2022. So within this, some of those features are around a whole family focus, thinking about the level of intensity and consistency from practitioners being kind of key requisites and important, opportunities for undertaking group case discussions featuring around supporting practice. We spend a lot of time talking about multidisciplinary work and multi-agency work, but thinking about that multidisciplinary skill set and about how that comes together to support families. There's no real absolutely key part of all of this is supporting people in their direct work and direct interventions with families and supporting enabling practitioners to do skilled work in this arena. a very big underpinning around systemic approaches to practice as being an enabler here, and also using a clear strength-based practice framework, highlighting where families are doing well rather than, if you like, over prioritizing deficits. So these are, again, a number of features that to hold in mind, and maybe apply that to your current models and approaches to social work and practice models within your organisations or authorities. So next slide, please.
I think what we're doing here is sharing a bit of a snapshot of where we are in England, where we are within differing local authorities. It may not be fully reflective of everywhere, but as a whole, and this would be supported by foundations, and it'll be familiar to some of you as what was the What Works Centre. Although we talked about there being an increasing research base around the benefits of particular practice models, it's kind of contradicted by empirically, I suppose, that little is known around which service and practice models work best, especially given the focus which I've just shared around the need for multi-agency and more system-wide focus, especially around those kind of multi-agency relationships. So it's great to hear that foundations will be generating new knowledge about what works best. I think what I'm emphasising here is that we should and could and ought to be doing it ourselves within our authorities and in our own practice. We can self-evaluate the benefits of the direct work we're involved in. There's something about that word purpose, isn't there? That unease and uncertainty or kind of tedium of repetition that we often find ourselves doing, or can find ourselves doing through the same old visit. What if we actually stood outside that and looked at the benefits and purpose of what we're doing? And if we can't see it, actually use those opportunities, for example, supervision, group supervision, reflective circles, all the kind of the toolkit of ideas that we may have from particular models for practice, and just stand outside that and look into what we might do ourselves as well, which might feed into some of the opportunities created by the National Practice Framework.
If we move on, wanted now to talk about anti-racist practice, which is a key priority for us within the Principal Social Worker Network across both children's and with our adult colleagues as well. So just like you to reflect for a moment about when we think about the practice models and practice that you're involved in, to what extent or how have they evolved in relation to supporting approaches to anti-racist practice? And just thinking about to what extent have the systemic issues of institutional racism been addressed or are being addressed, which we would say from a network point of view remains an extraordinarily difficult challenge.
And Paul, I think we had this conversation earlier as well around the intent and the deliberateness. I think I've invented that word, but deliberately naming and putting anti-racist practice within today's session, how that connects to the application and conversation around practice models, and how it should and could, and in some cases already does, become a feature of conversations throughout our practice, throughout our deliberations around making things work better. Because if we can't address anti-racism, it's highly unlikely we'll be able to address other issues of oppression and discrimination elsewhere.
And how can practice models contribute to addressing some of these key issues around white privilege and play a really pivotal role in supporting the approach to dismantling racism? I'm really influenced by this idea that racism within society has not happened by accident. It's been socially constructed over many generations, and how in our role of social workers and as a social work profession are we playing out a pivotal role in responding to and addressing racism that currently exists. So if we move on to the next slide, this is deliberately focusing on becoming anti-racist as opposed to non-racist. So this continuum offers you an invitation to think about where things have been or where things were around a colour-blind approach to where we, not so much where we want things to be, where we need things to be. in terms of having a direct and explicit understanding around race, how we see race, culture and ethnicity reflected in our direct work, in our assessments, and actually standing up and being anti-racist social workers. So it's kind of important to think about, where do you feel you are right here, right now on this continuum? So that will be kind of one thing to invite you to think about. The other aspect to this would be, what would other people say about you as an anti-racist worker or leader? Something that I think it's really important to keep coming back to on a day-to-day basis.
And surrounding that, Paul, also is potentially the idea that how might particular practice models support that awareness, that challenge, that opportunity for dialogue. Yeah,
and if we move the slides on, I think we'd all recognise this is not easy. It's far from easy. These conversations can be really uncomfortable. But I think for me, I think for us, this really resonates. It really is time we become comfortable with the uncomfortable conversations about race, and we need to move away from being colourblind to being colour brave. And I think the challenge for us as white practitioners is nothing like the experience of our black staff and black people in society who are experiencing racism on a day-to-day basis. So I think our invitation is we need to be kind of going further and stepping up more.
Well, it's an invitation that can be incorporated into the conversations and activity we're all involved in relating to our social work practice. It shouldn't and can't be an add-on or a special module, can it? I think it's how you encourage that dialogue around difference, around opportunity throughout all the things we're involved in, both in work with children and families and relationships with children and families, but also with each other. Hence the reason that we also included it today.
And I think I think in some respects it's creating the time, the space, reflective opportunities to prioritise conversations about race and racism, isn't it? So that becomes part of your working day. And if those opportunities aren't there, it's about, I suppose, the reflective questions would be about how in our organisations can we create those spaces, those conversations to take place. So if we move the slides on.
Sorry, Paul. Yeah, we've already addressed this a little bit. I think it's adding another question for you as individual practitioners, either personally, but also if you want to add it to the chat. Really, it's how does your approach to social work, including any information or prompts you may have from the practice model, support anti-racist practice? And there's a tension in there, isn't there? Because I wonder if it isn't, what else might or could happen. Okay. If we move on again. Interestingly, Paul and I had spent a lot of time just thinking around, well, what these practice models, where are they? What are they? And linking back to the conversation we're having about being students quite a long time ago, when there was very clearly a theoretical basis, many of which I've now forgotten. There's some recurrent kind of themes around practice models in England, aren't there, that we touch on and we make use of, or we don't, or we choose from. Many are systemic in origin. Almost all of them are relationship based in many extents. Lots of them make use of restorative ideas. And then we go into a bit more kind of focus to them. Some are far more case based and contextual or linked to crisis intervention. I wouldn't possibly even go near attachment regulation and competency frameworks, but I'm sure we could. There is a tension and opportunity in a kind of model that privileges and emphasises cultural humility and cultural competence, very much looking into what Paul was sharing around anti-racist practice. There's an increasing focus on solution-focused approaches with the opportunities that creates, but also perhaps some of the gaps it might also encourage. through brevity or whatever. And there's a theme that persisted for, for 20, 30, 40 years around anti-oppressive practice. But I suppose now it's actually, what does that mean in practice, acting anti-oppressively?
So
how effective are we talking about power?
A rich tapestry of different approaches out there. I just wondering aloud in terms of bearing in mind that if we think about even in England, social workers practicing across a number of different authorities in different settings using different approaches, and just thinking about the experience from a child, young person or family's point of view of being in a dialogue with social workers coming from different theoretical and practice-based places. So it's a fascinating thing to reflect on and discuss. Which leads us to the next slide, which is really for you to take a few moments to yourselves, maybe write some ideas down, put something into the system here around what are the practice models that you're currently utilising to inform your practice. Is it one defined model? Are you drawing upon some different approaches and disciplines? To what extent has that evolved over time?
And I think what we'd want to do is expand on that. So rather than potentially the confines of a practice model, what if we also frame that question? And this was Nikki's suggestion earlier. What principles and ideas actually inform your practice? Where do those principles come from? What ideas actually on a day-to-day basis drive what you do and how you do it?
So I'll give you a moment there to kind of pause and reflect. So we're going to now move on and share some examples from practice. So I'm going to speak for a few moments about the Essex approach to practice. So move on to the next slide. This kind of jigsaw for me is one of it's probably been the most important slide for me. I've been in Essex now 7 years. It's probably the most important slide that I see as a reference point. It's called the conditions for success, but it's that overarching architecture and interrelationships of different aspects that come together to support practice. So it's given due weight and attention to working conditions, system structures, role within teams, support, what we're saying about practice, and it's that interplay of all those different factors to allow social workers to be in a good space to work with children, young people and families, underpinned by practical support. And also a key feature of this is thinking about continuing professional development and also supporting reflection and learning. So it's all those ingredients coming together. The importance of having manageable workloads, having the opportunities to be really clear about practice, but also having a lot of dialogue as well around practice at different levels, and a shared understanding around our core purpose, what we're trying to do and why. So I think all those different ingredients for me provide, if you like, the fundamental backbone or foundations for us to start to think about our work with children, young people and families. So if we move on to the next slide. Think about impact and making difference. We would talk about in Essex having a modern relationship-based approach to practice, working with families, very much coming from a strength-based approach. We don't particularly say it has to be one way. We very much think about it's very strength-based and systemic in origin and support, but very much now drawing quite heavily on trauma-informed practice models. We've got a kind of strong interplay around solution-focused and brief intervention approaches as well, drawing upon other aspects of things like motivational interviewing, and also operate within a space of safe uncertainty. I think one of the key things here is though about how we apply these different and synthesize these approaches with care, taking time and intelligently.
That was a key thing
Yeah.
that came across when I saw that board. Applying these intelligently is kind of the secret ingredient, isn't it? This isn't just a really lovely list of wonderful things.
Yeah.
it takes some emotional intelligence to actually work out why you might be doing that and what the implications are.
So if we move on to the next slide, this slide highlights one of our practice tools, which is the race, ethnicity, culture, religious beliefs thinking tool. So we've generated a number of thinking tools, practice guides to support practice. This is one of the key ones that we're utilising at the moment, thinking about our understanding around how power and privilege can shape our work and relationships, and really using this as one of our key focuses to support our anti-racist approach to practice. So if we move on, we've talked a lot today about the complexities of the current working world. We are working with children, young people and families, often in situations of crisis, uncertainty, and we can't operate in a space of safe certainty, and we can't fully eliminate risks. So we're working with people in transit in complexities. I think the other thing we would also say is the working world, I think, does look quite different post-pandemic as we've moved away from lockdown and some of the things that's brought into the arena that we're now needing to grapple with. Within the most difficulties are within crisis situations. There is the opportunity to use that as a propensity for change, but again, that's in the context of working with and alongside families. Applying intelligence means working in a coherent coherent way, taking into account the theoretical grounds and underpinnings, but not taking a scattergun approach. But it's really deeply steeped in getting alongside and understanding family narratives, understanding their experiences and working alongside. So direct work and spending time with families forms a very big feature. Confident practitioners are absolutely fundamental. So giving people the skill set, the tools, the reflection opportunities to feel positive about their role. So when they go into difficult situations, they're able to work intelligently, supportively alongside children, young people and families. And having that right support in place in the back office around supervision and the importance of the team environment to allow all of that to flourish. So there's some of the things that underpin our approach to social work. So moving back to Rob.
Thanks, Pauline. It was interesting, that last slide, because just thinking again about practice models and theory for change, it's not as if you are necessarily privileging one thing. There are a variety of different approaches, different resources, different ways of looking at systems that you're making use of in your authority.
And we have to be aware, Rob, don't we, of like emerging changes in practice, wisdom, research, and also taking into account societal changes, change in policy legislation, possible judgments from the court. So there's a whole rich interplay of things that we have to take into account that informs our practice.
Yeah. Okay. So moving on from that, when we were planning this, we really wanted to emphasize and privilege the power of conversation and talking about talk, but also talk into action as well. So I'm really happy, so happy to be joined by 3 different colleagues from both Gloucestershire and Bristol, all who've been involved with me and lots of other people in developing a systemic practice approach in the Southwest. And it will be different in Bristol as it is in Gloucestershire, but what we're also doing, and I think what Systemic Ideas have encouraged us to do, is create a bit of a shared language around practice and practice change that is proving to be really useful and really interesting and quite exciting. So you're now going to be involved. You are zooming in as an audience into a very private conversation between 4 people, which is a conversation about change, but also very much about a change in the conversation. What we're going to try and do also, I don't know how inept or otherwise this might be, but is also try and emphasize some of the systemic ideas that have supported this shift in thinking and created the kind of ideas and possibilities that are moving practice forward for us in the Southwest. So Victoria, if you could move the slide on, I wonder if it'll work.
It's working.
Oh, and it works as well. Okay. So I'm here with Joe. You're the PSW in Bristol. Yeah.
I am, yes. Sorry
And you-
for joining you a little late here. Some technical issues in my context.
Absolutely.
But yes, I'm Jo Coles. I'm the principal social worker here in Bristol.
That's brilliant. And I'm also here with Sarah and Nikki, who we've introduced already. And so we were just going to have a bit of a conversation, I guess, being curious around what's this then, this practice model? What's the point of it? What have you made use of in the opportunity that it might have created? I'm staring at you, Nikki. I don't mean to.
So working as a team manager, I suppose we've embraced some systemic ideas. And what that means for me and what's really important for me is the relationships. And I think in some of the stuff you talked about earlier, in terms of what Eileen said, you had a conversation with Eileen, and she absolutely talked about the priorities of relationships and really understanding each other and seeing each other, and whatever that is, whatever makes you you, and whatever makes your lens, that we're giving the time and the space for those really deep connections. I think that's really important. And that's been a big focus, I think, for me. I think along also with that, perhaps a changing in the language that we're using and how we find out about people. So we're asking more questions, we're being more curious to have that sort of depth of understanding.
And it's interesting being involved for quite a while in Gloucestershire relating to systemic, that people find that so appealing, the idea of it and the permissions that creates, but it's also quite scary as well. Those deep connections, bringing ourselves into that relationship, let alone for the family we're involved in. We're used to those patterns of expectation, if not punitive expectations. That's quite a shift, isn't it?
So I think that's why that's so important, really, isn't it? That we recognise that, because I sometimes, when someone asks me about systemic practice, to sort of describe what that looks like compared with what we were maybe doing previously, I often think about what it was like when I first became a social worker 16 years ago, and what my training involved, and the conversations were around, if a family asks you about yourself, you don't talk about yourself. You're not there to talk about yourself, and I was taught to kind of shut that conversation down. And now I look back and I think, what must that feel like for a family in that situation, where you've got somebody in your house asking you all these questions, very personal questions, and as soon as there's something asked about you, you close it down as if there's no connection between your own social graces and the social graces of the family that you're with. And I look back and I think, gosh, that's such different practice now to how we're training our social workers and our new social workers coming through in terms of systemic practice. And I think that has got to be so much more valuable in terms of building relationships with the children and families that we work with. So that's just one of the sort of examples, I suppose, that come to my mind when I think of the sort of stark differences.
Yeah, I definitely think we're having those. We're being brave, aren't we? Being brave enough to have those conversations about difference at the outset of any relationship, and whether that's with a family or with your colleagues or partner agencies. I think we're better at that. But it feels uncomfortable. You talked about that earlier. It feels hard to say, is there a thing that's different between us that's going to get in the way? How is that going to show up for us? I think that can be hard.
And hard for families as well.
Yeah,
definitely.
Trusting you and themselves to be that open. So,
and that's why that's so important to acknowledge power differences as well in those conversations, isn't it? Because we can't deny the power that we have as social workers, whether that's perceived or actual power. That does impact on our relationships with the people that we work with.
Yeah. Sorry,
Sarah, carry on.
No. So I was just thinking what you were saying then, Nikki and Rob, about how that positions us with families. If what families and some families, sadly, we will have been involved with for generations, maybe 1 or 2, 3 generations, and we turn up and we start asking questions in a very different way, that can feel really uncomfortable, I think, for families. And so I think we need to be really clear about our intentionality about why we're having this conversation in this different way, and what we hope that that's going to create for them and for us. Because it's how we position ourselves, isn't it? It's not just tell me everything about you. It is about that sharing a little bit of yourself, but it's also then stepping back and thinking, the family said that. Why did that? What did that trigger for me? Why? What filter am I seeing that through? And it connects to something that Paul mentioned a few slides ago around white privilege. I was in a conversation with someone last week, And I was kind of, you know, if you'd have looked from the outside in, I was the person in the position of power. I was the one facilitating this conversation. And she asked me, how does what I've told you leave you feeling? I was like, wow. And in that moment, I felt acutely aware of my white privilege. And it was it opened up for us a really different conversation, that she was able to be curious with me. I was able to be kind of reflect in that moment and then be reflexive. And it changed the conversation we had, because it's how we position ourselves, but how also we describe that to families, because we've got to. We can't just turn up asking them very different questions and leaving them feeling very differently, but explaining a little bit why we're doing that, because that could feel really quite uncomfortable.
So is that explaining the difference from kind of stepping away from the expert, and really being clear about that and explicit that actually you're the expert in your family, and doing that from the outset.
I guess linking that to the conversation around practice models, there's a really good kind of message for myself here in a kind of description of the social process, which I guess might be familiar to lots of people, but is a way of looking at power and difference. But it's a really good quote. I'm aware that aspects of difference influence how I am experienced in relationships, and I'm attentive to the power imbalances that this creates. And it's as simple as that, really. Just keeping that in mind creates that reflexivity around any kind of involvement you might have. Even now, you know, there are lots of dynamics taking place.
If we want to be anti-oppressive and really hold in mind that anti-oppressive practice and anti-racist practice, then that's where it all begins. We have to really attend to that and kind of, you know, note that when that's happening.
So Nikki, you said something a bit earlier when we were talking around systemic practice being maybe a set of guiding principles. This isn't a manual. Why isn't it a manual?
Why isn't it a manual? Because each family, each system, whether that's a family, a team, an organisation, is really different. So the manual or the rule book for what works in my family is not what works for you. And if I gave you the manual, it wouldn't work. So, you know, that's a kind of easy way, I think, to. And for me, it's about the guiding principles are an ethos about how we want to be with each other, and that might be something that we can set out in our teams or in our families at the outset. Is how do we want to communicate with each other? What are the agreed, you know, permissions here? So I think that's why it's not a manual.
It's a way to be that informs the way that the things that we do. It's a way of being, isn't it? It connects to us on a really deeply personal level.
And I suppose I think maybe it's how I perceive models. It feels fixed and perhaps a bit prescriptive and a bit like, well, we have to do it in this way, and I don't think that's the right thing. I think we talked about holding things lightly, and as practitioners, we're using all sorts of knowledge, aren't we? All sorts of theories and models and reflecting in the moment. So we need to be open to continue to do that. So holding it lightly.
And Joe, I think that connects very much to some of the conversations that we increasingly had in the southwest of England between different authorities, which is kind of identifying what we had in common rather than what kept us apart. And that was beyond the kind of performance indicators and statistical neighbourhood envy or whatever, and thinking more around what are the conversations we could be having as practitioners. Definitely. Using systemic ideas to encourage learning from each other and the different contexts that we live in compared with Bristol and Gloucestershire, for example. And that's been really, really exciting.
It's been really exciting, and I think it's an example of how we've developed a new system, haven't we? A new way of relating to each other, I suppose. And it's, I think, led to some really interesting conversations and new context, really, to share some of those ideas. And I think you're right. We've moved. So in systemic practice, there's a model called the domains model, which is one of my favourite. In there, we talk about the domain of production, which is around sort of processes and perhaps things that we have to do under our statutory duties. And the domain of explanation is where we take more of a questioning approach. And then the domain of aesthetics is where we think about what we're doing and how we're going to do it. And I kind of think that's what we're doing in the Southwest at the moment. We're thinking about what we do and how we're going to do it, but we're thinking about that on a wider scale than just within our own local authority, and that's really exciting for me. So yeah, there's lots of exciting opportunities coming up, I think.
And there's parallels really helpfully with work with families and relationships with families, isn't it?
100%.
So it's not
Definitely.
going in with a prescription, it's eliciting the possibility. And I know it's easy for me to say, and it's pretty far harder, out there doing it, but I suppose what it does do is create that opportunity around possibility, an invitation to look at the same old story in a very, very different way.
Definitely. And before I became principal social worker a year ago, I was in child protection for 15 years, and that's where I did my systemic training initially. So I think there's maybe some ideas around how it can or can't work in child protection work, and the things that we have to do within that work. We have the statutory duties to do that, but there are ways of doing those things, those tasks systemically, and in a relationship-based way. I feel very strongly about that.
Yeah. And I think what we found helpful also is that within the national practice framework and also the early careers framework, the introduction of systemic ideas into some of the opportunities, if not expectations within that, is down to us as practitioners to actually then work out what does that look like in the context of the different authorities and teams we work in. Interestingly, I'm now aware that it's 12 minutes past 4. So I think this very private conversation probably continued for a while, but we'll probably stop it there. But that was just one example of four practitioners in one part of the country making use of getting really excited by a practice model, and I guess the opening up of opportunity it might create doesn't make the conditions that we work in any immediately easier. It probably highlights some of the barriers there are, but it creates a language and I guess more opportunity for dialogue and collaboration with other people in a way that we haven't done before.
And perhaps an opportunity to write the script as what we do here.
Yeah. Which goes right back to what I used to.
Thanks very much, everyone, for sharing your reflections. So interesting to be part of these discussions before and listening to you articulate some of your reflections around this important work. So move on to the next slide. We're on the home straight now. So just individually thinking about the practice models that are underpinning your work, and it's kind of what's key here that we're inviting you to think about is how you know you're making a difference. What are your approaches to understand that in terms of feedback loops directly from children, young people and families, in terms of what you may understand from your own internal processes? And we've touched on today in terms of, we know there are others who form views about the quality of our practice, and thinking particularly about the role of Ofsted, and also as well, as we talked about earlier, in terms of the national practice framework is inviting us to think quite carefully about the impact of the work that we're doing. So it'd be great to hold that in mind as we now move to the next slide.
It's a concluding slide, and again, it's the 3 words that are probably familiar to lots of us: making a difference. It's what we talk about a lot, isn't it? The doing it, or knowing we've done it, is sometimes a bit more difficult. Maybe thinking about practice models supports that. It creates a bit more of a tension around, well, what difference have I actually made? Just wanted to leave a few questions for you to ponder now and into the future, really. So thinking about impact, who holds the highest context for it? Is it those that regulators and inspectors? Is it our managers? Is it our elected members in county councils? Or is it the public, or is it ourselves? Is it the children and families that we work with? What is this thing called impact? How do we know as practitioners that we're making a difference? How do you, as an individual social worker or social care worker, know what works? Does anyone ask you? Do we create the opportunities and the dialogue we have to talk around, our successes and our failures, and importantly, our failures? Actually, perhaps we need another word for that. Yeah. How do we evaluate the difference we're making? There's a whole industry of quality assurance that we have very varied perceptions around. But as individual practitioners, how do we make use of that? How do we move beyond one narrative around quality assurance and audit, for example, or inspection, and look at different ways of looking at that story? And then I suppose finally, what might you take away from the past hour and a quarter? I hope something. And what might you do differently following Paul and I and everyone else's involvement today? And that's kind of the usual thing we ask at the end of everything. But I suppose it's just it's leaving a bit of a silence to just think around, you know, what is your theory for change? Where does it come from? Did it stop when you finished that degree last year or 30 years ago? You know, how do we maintain that?
And some of our final reflections before actually being here today, it was just also posing that kind of thought: how important is it as a profession that we have practice models that we can confidently articulate and talk to? Does it matter? Does it make a difference? Is it key to us as a profession? So that's a kind of further thought that we've also been spending some time reflecting on. So if we move the slides on, we've built in quite a few pauses for you to quietly think to yourselves. But I think that takes us to the next slide, which is open to questions within the Q&A.
So yeah, Victoria, I think you were collating things, weren't you?
Yeah, I'm gonna just put myself on the screen now. Hello, everyone, and just ask a few of the questions that have come in. There's been quite a lot, and they're around themes, so we might not be able to cover them all. And apologies to everyone if I can't cover your question. One of them here is, and again, this is a theme, so it's similar to some other questions being asked. That's why it was chosen. How do you work with families when there's a clash between your values versus the organisational values? And I think it might be interesting to hear from some of the practitioners as well. So possibly any takes in a response?
It's not necessarily hard to respond in the absence of the context of the question, but I suppose it might illustrate that thing around if the value base of the organisation is unclear or disjointed, and there isn't that opportunity through supervision to reflect on and explore some of the disconnects between your own feelings and especially your own experiences and your own value base, that might be a recipe for things not quite connecting together.
I suppose what I would add is I think we're in a very, I think in a wider societal context, it's very challenging, possibly unprecedentedly challenging, given some of the events that are happening in the wider world, but also given our most recent history about, how society was fundamentally changed over the last few years and coming out of the aftermath of that. I think the importance is how we create opportunities within organisations for debates around practice that support local discussions about how individuals work with children and families, but also about how we are approaching social work more generally. I think there's a time and space for both. And that needs to involve, I think, people at all levels of the organisation, from frontline staff right through to senior leaders.
Thanks. I'll come in with another question just so we can get through some more. This is quite a long question, so just bear with me a moment. But I think it's a really interesting one. What are your thoughts around the challenges of implementing a value base as part of a practice model, particularly given that it is very easy to measure what tools are being used, but how practice is being done or how tools are being used may not be measurable? I ask because this is the person asking the question, obviously. I ask because I practice outside the local authority, where there are issues I can often see about how practice is being experienced by the family, and it's very different from the practice model of the local authority, even when tools belonging to a specific practice model are being used.
Not true.
I want to talk about emotion, and I don't know if that speaks to both of those questions about your values having an emotional basis, and that we need to ensure that we have spaces for people to be emotional about the work that they do in a psychologically safe way. I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but this is the stuff that's kind of coming up for me, and so we need to make sure that people have the ability, if something is a disconnect with something they believe in, that they can share that and explore that in a psychologically safe way to kind of unpick it and work through it.
And I suppose linked to the latter question as well, I suppose that's always the danger with if you apply something here's the latest model, everyone will do it. But we know that if you create an orthodoxy or an expectation, it won't fit for everybody. People need to make their own journey, understanding why a particular model might be a worthwhile one. And I suppose that's why systemic practice for us, and we're only in the very early stages of understanding the implications of it and the risks within it. What it's enabled us to do is just to create more of a tension around practice than a solution, which I think is really, really helpful, because it creates some self-doubt around your own practice, around the impact of you in that visit, for example. And for some people, that's going to be really uncomfortable, because it can be a scary place, can't it? Especially if the other resources relating to supervision and team culture are not where they could or should be. That creates more vulnerabilities. So that hasn't answered that question fully at all, but I think there always will be tensions within that. That's probably, it's a good thing, but it's also something we should be aware of as well. How do you change your culture? It's not a static thing, or a linear thing. It's surrounding us, and there will always be, justifiably, there will be difference, and there needs to be difference. There needs to be dissent and non-compliance within that, because that creates further tension and the further dialogue that's necessary. I think it's very helpful for the family, I know.
But we have to remember
I think as well we need to think about our role as a profession in terms of, I'm thinking particularly around advocacy and agency, and as a profession we advocate wider at a kind of a more global level about things such as social circumstances, poverty, discrimination, and how that is a fundamental part of the social work role alongside what we're doing on a day-to-day level.
Thanks very much for that. That's great. And now there's another question, and this is it's specifically naming Jo, but does open it up to everyone else. It says, could Jo or anyone else describe a bit more about how child protection tasks can be done in a systemic way? Maybe an example or two.
I suppose that's I mean, I could probably talk about that for a very long time. We've not got very long, but
you've got 2 minutes.
No problem. So I can think of a particular example. So when I was doing my intermediate systemic training, I was working with a care leaver parent, for example. So we'd had to convene a child protection conference for her children, and I was very aware of her potentially her narrative around the intervention of children's services, her experiences of social workers, and what the stories told and stories lived by her around these processes. So I wanted to think really carefully about how I involved her in the process of the Section 47 inquiries, for example. I tried to take a much more collaborative approach with her. So we co-wrote the child protection, the Section 47 report for conference. So I obviously had some of my own ideas about what needed to go in there from the perspectives of other professionals that were worried about particular things, or some worries that I had myself. So I need to be very explicit about those. But I made sure that I carved out enough time that we could create this document together, so that it was something that she maybe didn't agree with everything that was in there, but actually I also took the time to go through the report and actually use her comments in there to say, this is what this person is worried about, this is something that Mum doesn't agree. I'm going to call her Mum for confidentiality, but I didn't say Mum in the report, obviously. This is something that this is Mum's perspective on this. And it was really, I tried to use systemic ideas, even though it was a Section 47 report. I tried to use systemic ideas in how I was writing that and how I approached carrying that out with the parents, so that it recognised her own experiences. It had her own words and her own language in there. It had the perspectives of the professionals who were worried about particular things, but it also had the mum's perspective in there on the things that she disagreed with. And then in the analysis, I tried to bring forth some of the things that we talked about around her experiences of having had social workers in her life, and how this has affected her experience of coming to a conference with her own children. So that was one thing I did in terms of creating the report with her, to taking more collaborative approach, I suppose, but really recognising the multiple perspectives in that, and also the history and narrative around that for her. And then in terms of the actual conference itself, then I was able to meet with the chair beforehand, arrange that with her, work in more of a relationship based way, so that it was making that experience, it was recognizing her experiences and what that might bring up for her in terms of kind of triggers around what she'd experienced herself in her childhood. So that's a bit of a long-winded example,
no,
but
that's
kind of one example,
I'm only cutting you off, and apologies, because there's one quick question I just want to leave with, which is, are there any new or emerging practice models that you feel are helping to move practice forward? That's to everyone, but we really just do have 2 minutes, so maybe unhelpful, but I did want to leave with that.
Paul, I think the examples you had in Essex were really helpful, because it's not one practice model. There are aspects which all may contain systemic principles within them, and make more sense with that frame surrounding it. But I don't know if there's anything.
I think what I'd add to that is what's our understanding about the effectiveness of what we do and why. And I think ultimately, who is the arbiter of that, and who is, back to the highest context, which I think ultimately is the people that we work with and what they're experiencing. And do we have that kind of congruence and connection between what we think we're doing and why, and what people are experiencing from the interventions that we actually undertake? And going back to the earlier part of what we said in terms of that kind of, I think, quite complex interplay between policy, procedure, documentation, direct work, and how all that architecture fits together. And I think it's really important we remain curious, we remain humble, and remain open to challenge, and also that we're prepared to adapt and change as society changes, and the challenges facing children, young people, and families also change.
And just to add to that, I think that recent developments and enthusiasm and challenge around relational practice, especially around family-led and kind of whatever co-production means in a safeguarding and child protection context, and the tensions within that, I think that's really welcome as a next step, especially in the context of the national framework.
I just want to take it on myself then to thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to all of you who've taken the time this afternoon. Thanks to all our presenters for presenting a really fascinating session. It's been a real pleasure to be with you. Look out for some of the other events at Social Work Week, and have a good Wednesday.